The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Hello, my name is Addie Guttag, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 92nd Street Y series on illustrious women. Our guest this evening, Congresswoman Pat Schroeder, is a senior-ranking woman in the House of Representatives, a member of the powerful House Armed Service Committee, the Judiciary Committee, the Select Committee on Children, Youth, and Families, and the Post Office and Civil Service Committee. In addition, in her position as co-chair of the Congressional Caucus for Women's Issues, she is one of our nation's most articulate representatives of and for all women. Congresswoman Schroeder has made a career out of confounding expectations and broadening our notions of what women can do. She fought hard to win her position on the Armed Service Committee, not exactly a traditional female bastion, and won. Pat has made her mark as a strong and effective advocate for America's families. She comes to this naturally. A mother of 2 children, she is the only member of Congress to have landed in Washington for her first term with a briefcase containing both briefing papers and diapers. Since then, she has led campaigns for pension reform, pay equity, daycare, and job protection for those taking time off caring for ill family members. Last year, while the other candidates were traveling, kissing babies, and eating pork rinds, Pat organized the Great American Family Tour, a traveling roadshow dedicated to issues touching the American family. For too many politicians, family is just a campaign buzzword. Pat has made it her own personal legislative priority. This is also the woman who coined the term the Teflon presidency. She has been called our only legislator who can draft a bill, stir a crowd, fly a plane, coin a phrase, bake a cake, and run for president. But with characteristic modesty, Pat pointed out that isn't entirely true. She just knows a bakery that delivers. But run for president she did. In 1987, Congresswoman Schroeder formed an exploratory committee and spent 4 months seeking the Democratic nomination. In that effort, she raised almost $1 million, had a significant impact on framing the issues of the 1988 presidential campaign, and proved beyond doubt that a woman could be a credible, competitive candidate for our highest office. Her candidacy was another step in helping women take our rightful place in the leadership of this country. Watching Pat on the Today Show this morning, I learned that a major ambition of hers is to be Secretary of Defense. After the events of the last 2 weeks, Pat, I understand the position may be opened. Personally, I think she'll be well qualified. Anyone who has explained the concept of sharing to a room full of 4-year-olds has the right credentials to handle the Soviets on the one hand and the Pentagon contractors on the other. And isn't it time we had a defense secretary whom we could be sure wasn't womanizing? While she's waiting, Pat has found time to write her autobiography, Champion of the Great American Family. The book has been praised for its directness, its honesty, and Pat's wonderful ability to coin a phrase. So it's a great deal of pleasure I give you Congresswoman Pat Schroeder.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you all for coming out. I see lots of friends out here, and I thank you for coming out to the 92nd Street Y. I always like a number that's higher than my age, and it's getting hard to find it, so this is great. Yes, we are out doing this book tour, and I thought I'd talk a little bit about what we've been trying to do in the Congress and what's happening, and then we'll open it up for questions, because I think that the world changes faster than you can write a speech anymore. But one of the things that did transpire is I did come to Congress in 1972 with a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old, and I started talking about all these family issues. And the world kept changing so that more and more people's lives look like mine, and that we never passed any of this legislation. 16 years later, nothing has happened, except that we have many more people in the workplace and many more people struggling valiantly to balance career, marriage, family, home, all these types of things. And we only heap a lot more stress on them. So we did, during the last presidential election, decide that what we'd do was go out on this great American family tour. And we went to all the primary states and proceeded to outdraw all the candidates. Now, one of the frustrations was that the candidates, when you were asking them about family issues, they told you about their family. So you realized they weren't getting it. The other was, I had thought for a while after Gary Hart got out, we in Colorado thought he was our candidate for this year. I thought, well, if I'm frustrated that they're not talking about the issues, then maybe I should go out there and start talking about the issues. So I went out and started talking about issues in my little exploratory journey. And what would happen then is that I found people wouldn't listen to the issues. They only wanted to deal with my novelty. You would finish a whole speech on whatever it was you were talking, and the first question would be, why are you running as a woman? And I thought, well, I'm not getting through with my issues either. This is not working real well. How do I get to the issues rather than the fact that I don't look presidential, which I know that. I mean, there's never been a president that looked like me. It's President's Week. I don't look like Lincoln. I don't look like Jefferson. I don't look like any of them. I mean, I know that. And yet I just could not get beyond that. They wanted to focus on that part and not the issue part. So I thought, okay, so that's not working. So forget this. Now what do we do? So we decided to do an issue tour. So we hit New Hampshire a week before the primary, outdrew all the candidates. They then said, well, that's just New Hampshire. It's kind of crazy and everything. You haven't tried the South. So we thought, all right. So we did Atlanta, we did South Carolina, we did Florida, we went roaring through the South, Arkansas, the whole bit, right before that Super Tuesday. And one more time, outdrew all the candidates. So then they wanted to know if they couldn't please have the list of the people who came to our meetings, and on and on and on and on. And then all of a sudden, after I'd spent 16 years trying to get candidates into child care centers, we couldn't get them out. Every time we looked up, they were in there. Their body language was always very interesting. It was like, what if one of these things touches me? You know, I mean, they were not real comfortable, but they understood that they should be there and that they should be part of it. And they started talking about family issues, and the question we have now is, can we convert any of those promises into legislation? Now I have several different premises as you look. What are family issues? Number one, if we had a great map of the world up here and we colored in every country that had better family policies than we did, we'd color in every single country except South Africa, Burkina Faso, Sudan, and Guyana. Those are the big five. Now, what do I mean by family policy? Well, number one, we're the only country where you can be fired for having a baby. It's like a criminal act. We have absolutely no protection to anyone who has a baby or adopts a baby. That's a risk that they run. That would be the first thing we would try to pass, a family medical leave policy that allows either a male or female 10 weeks leave without pay upon birth or adoption of a baby, or if they have a parent or a spouse, a dependent parent or a spouse or a child that gets chronically ill and needs help. One more time, if my mother lives in Denver, Colorado, and she has a stroke, I could be fired for going there to help. No other country does that. That doesn't make any sense. So we think that whole package of just not a paid leave, but just making sure you can't lose your job while you deal with some of those family responsibilities is very important. Obviously, dealing with child care is terribly important. We know that a child from 0 to 3 learns more than Einstein or any of the rest of us learn the whole rest of their lives. Very critical time. And yet, we pay child care workers of that age in this country less than we pay parking lot attendants. They're going to dig this society up and think that we worship those bloody cars. I mean, that doesn't make any sense at all, that you are paying parking lot attendants more than people who work in child care. As a consequence, you don't have the specialties in college anymore of early childhood development. Nobody can afford that. You have a constant churning of people going through child care centers. We have pediatricians. We took Dr. Brazelton from Harvard with us on this tour. He brought his wonderful movies from Harvard Medical School of babies and how, we don't know why, but within the first couple of days they recognized both the mom and the dad's voice equally. Kids do not discriminate. And that is really how they relate to the world. You see these wonderful bonding films, and it's very touching. And when pediatricians tell us they don't know which kids will get in trouble, but they can tell you which ones won't, seems to me we ought to listen. In a society where we got so many kids in trouble, we ought to listen real carefully. When they can tell you they don't know which kids will use drugs, but they can tell you which kids won't, again, we ought to be really listening, because that's serious. If you look at our tax code, you know, our tax code discriminates terribly against women. They just put back in, or in families, it just put back in the marriage penalty tax. You do better off raising thoroughbred horses or dogs than you do children. All sorts of crazy things in there that are really ridiculous. So, I mean, that's a very important component of it. We don't give part-time work much dignity. So women who would like to keep their skills current, we treat them as though they're very lesser beings. So all of those things, I think, heap an awful lot of stress on families today. And while we do less than almost any other country for families, we are number one in all sorts of things you don't want to be number one in. We are number one in divorce in the world. We are number one in drug and alcohol abuse, in family violence, and in all sorts of other things. And it says to me, there might be a correlation. Voila. You know, it's like the bright light goes on the head. Do you suppose if we do less than any other country for families, and we have the worst statistics than any other country, there could be a connection? Possible. Secondly, in the other countries where they are doing so much for families, there are also countries where people even save more. I mean, they certainly save a lot more money in Japan than we do, and certainly in Western Europe, but they also have phenomenal family legislation that we don't have. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's define the American dream. We see a lot of people now saying that yuppies are in the workplace, and they ought to go home and lower their expectations and get rid of their BMW, and we'd all live happily ever after. Well, it's not yuppies in the workplace. The American dream is the same for this generation. It's a home, car. If you have kids, they want college for them, and health insurance. And that package is off the charts in price. It's off the charts. There's no way you can afford that package on one income. Legal Times, interestingly enough, was the magazine that nailed the Congress the closest on the pay raise issue and family issues. It pointed out, while in America, only 7% of our families today look like Ozzie and Harriet, or look like a Norman Rockwell painting. In the Congress, only 7 or 8% don't look like Ozzie and Harriet. It is the last bastion of traditional marriages. And so part of what the whole pay raise thing was about is they're trying to figure out an income that you can live on, one income. We'd all like to do that. The rest of society hasn't been able to do that, and so both are working, everybody's juggling. When I came out, they said absolutely never buy housing if it's going to take more than 25% of your income. Anybody know anyone in New York able to do that? Huh? Anybody? And what we're doing to people's lives that way by telling them and putting all this stress on them is just ridiculous. And what do we have for them for all this stress? We have seminars. on stress, where they tell you to go to a spa. Obviously a wonderful solution for what's going on. Now, if I take all the family issues, you say, well, okay, so 16 years, why haven't you been able to sell them in Washington? What kind of a salesperson is this? I'll tell you why. It's not a power issue in Washington. In Washington, D.C., we see ourselves as the most powerful capital of the most powerful nation, and we deal with power issues. And power issues are things like, in the post-INF environment, should the United States fund the Midget Man missile, the Minuteman missile, the MX missile, the cruise missile, the D5 missile, all of the above, some of the above, none of the above, and we will play with that like a kitten for days. Family issues, there are no political action committees for families. Toddlers don't invite you to speak at their daycare center and pay you an honorarium. You'd think they would. They're really not in that whole thing. And as I say, because politics is probably the last bastion of traditional marriages, I have spent all my life wanting a wife, as has my husband. Neither one of us got one. But if you have one and you've got a nice traditional marriage, why would you want to give it up? And they don't quite get what everybody else is going through in this society. Now, we've also got to look at another piece. The next thing people say is, oh, that's lovely, Pat, but it all costs money. And there's more lovely ideas for money than there's money. So we can't deal with that. I say, okay, I got that picture too. We are looking at closing out the 20th century. The 20th century was known as the American century. The question every one of us as Americans has to ask is, what is the 21st century going to be known as? And what is our role going to be? And how are we going to compete in this new global village that we're residing in? Well, that's when I think that I shift hats and I start looking at my defense hat. As I put on my defense hat and I look at how we have deployed our forces all over the world, we're deployed as though it's still 1945. The deployment made a tremendous amount of sense in 1945. It makes no sense in 1989. 1/3 of our bases are overseas. We just went through that whole base closing commission. They weren't allowed to look at one overseas base. Why? Because not a one of them could meet a domestic base on cost comparison. Not a one of them. Not only that, our foreign aid is getting distorted more and more into really extortion payments for these bases. Now, you've all seen it. Just in the last year, we went through A, Portugal, B, Spain, C, Greece, D, Turkey, and E, the Philippines. And that is where they all shoot at our feet and say, hey, Uncle Sam, quadruple the aid and maybe we'll let you stay here another year. And you can't imagine any state doing that. Imagine New York saying we're going to throw all the bases out of New York unless you quadruple state aid. It wouldn't happen. But that's what's happening internationally. So really our foreign aid at the national level has really become, a large percentage of it has become absolutely nothing but base payments for bases that really are supposed to protect the alliance. They're NATO bases or CETO bases. But none of our allies come deal and none of them help pay. We do it. Again, made a lot of sense in 1945. We were the only ones that could do it. But it doesn't make much sense today. If you go back and you look at this century again, and you say, why was this the American century? I think it's because we had phenomenal leadership in this country. I promise not to go through each decade, but I look at my husband's great-grandparents. They came over here to avoid the wars of Europe. What happened? World War I, and all their sons were loaded on ships to go fight the wars of Europe. How did they get that kind of political consensus? They did it. You look at what we did to come out of the Depression, was amazing. You look at World War II, they're back on ships, they're fighting overseas one more time. But the most amazing thing of World War II was we learned something from World War I. No one's ever seen what we did after World War II done before or after. And that was, here we are after this bloody, horrible war, and we had the American leadership walk out and say, I know everybody wants to come home, and I know you're all sick of the war, and I know you want to stop, spending all this money and pay off this debt, but guess what? We're going to borrow billions more, and we're going to rebuild the people that we're killing, your husbands, sons, uncles, brothers, just weeks ago. I said, what? Now think how easy it would be politically to stir up a real firestorm against somebody who did that. And yet we have political leadership who said, if we don't do this, if we don't cement those democracies with some economic stability, we're condemned to have another war. They sold it. We did it. No one's ever duplicated it. And boy, did it work. I mean, we ought to be celebrating. No one can ever say that the Japanese didn't get it. They got it. No one can ever see that the Europeans didn't get it. They got them, and they really did rebuild in a phenomenal way. I mean, you can even look at Eisenhower. Here's a man who paid his dues, was tired, would prefer to have played golf. And you even got to look at his leadership. His leadership was phenomenal because he had the misfortune to have Little Rock blow up during his term. And you can imagine what his political advisors said. It's a local issue. Stay out of it. Well, you'll set the Republican Party back 50 years if you move into the South. And he said, look, I was commander in Forces Europe. We put everybody in the front line equally. I learned two things. If they're wounded, they bleed the same color, and if they cry the same color tears. So look, no way. The Constitution says that everybody's got these rights, and he called out the National Guard. I mean, that was a very courageous thing for a man who didn't want to get involved. And you could look at each until we get to the 80s. And then we get to the 80s and someone says, hey, America now can't make any tough decisions. We can only deal with happy talk. We went into all those bumper stickers, I heart this, I heart that, rainbows, unicorns. And we bought all this stuff about, oh, wow, we can cut taxes, increase defense, and balance the budget. Vote for me. That's not too hard a sale. That's not too hard a sale. There's not a lot of pain involved in that. And yet, it didn't work. It's like a hot fudge sundae diet. When do you say, this is not working? We did not balance the budget. But we have totally convinced politicians everywhere that we as Americans can't deal with tough choices. We can't deal with reality. A rendezvous with reality is absolutely impossible for us to have to handle. And so when anything comes up, we just say, we can't do that, we can't afford it, we don't want to hear about it. Now, look at where we are, because we have not thought and we have not changed. As I said, we're deployed as we were in 1945. Last year in Western Europe alone, we spent $160 billion for defense. Those are DOD's figures, not mine. $160 billion. That was more than the deficit last year. Now, in those countries we were defending, they have a higher gross national product than we do. They also have 100 million more people than we do. So why are we there? What is so radical about saying, hey, you guys, you're in better shape than we are now? I think you can probably defend your own borders. We'll remain in the alliance. We're certainly not talking isolationism. We want to remain in the alliance, but we just don't have to pull the main oar. We don't have to be the only engine. Now, you just can't get politicians to deal with this, because instantly the editorial boards of the Washington Post and others come out and say this is an isolationist, and in Washington they'd rather be called a pervert. And it isn't isolationism at all. I think it's realism. And of course, you've got the same as you look at Japan. I mean, last year, the average American spent $1,200 for defense of the free world. The average European spent about $330. That's about a $900 difference. The average Canadian spent about $200, and the average Japanese about $100. Their taxes weren't lower, so what did they do with their money? Well, in those countries, they don't know what the words college tuition means. They pay for everybody's college, and they pay them to go to college. Child care programs they've got and funded, and they're excellent, and they're high quality, and they're, you name it. Health care. They've got health care of every kind you can think of. In Germany, they even have spa leave. Can you imagine somebody introducing spa leave in America? You'd be run out of the country. But the idea being, again, that people are going to be more productive, they're going to contribute more, and everything, if you give them a support system, and you really help them. And you know what? Apparently it worked. They're doing real well. And we're treating people as though they're throwaway bottles. In the interim, if we went into burden sharing and ask our allies to pick up more, we also have another wonderful window open that we haven't been taking advantage of. And that window that's open is called perestroika. We have a way to lower the whole burden if we would get involved. Now let me walk through that just a little bit. Number one, militarily, when you talk about the threat, you know, the threat, we all talk about the threat in Washington a lot. And when you talk about the threat, you talk about two things. You talk about, first and foremost, someone's capabilities. If they don't have the capability of rubbing you out, you don't worry about them very much. So first is, what are their capabilities? And then second, their intentions. You know, if they would like to rub you out, their intentions say they want to rub you out, but they don't have the capability, you don't worry. If they have the capabilities, then you're very worried about what their intentions are. Okay, so Gorbachev walks on the scene, and he says, okay, everybody, my intentions have changed. And our folks say, rightfully so. Well, that's nice, but your intentions can change in 5 seconds back. You haven't changed your capabilities, and that's what we look at. We got to be hard-nosed about this. Nice that your intentions have changed, but we're still going to sleep in the nightlight till you do something about your capabilities. Well, then he starts changing his capabilities unilaterally all over the lot. He says, okay, then we'll pull out of Afghanistan. And tonight, they did. Final soldiers getting on the airplane. Gone. Well, that's fairly shocking. We will pull 500,000 troops out of Eastern Europe. We will ask Warsaw Pact nations to pull theirs down. We will destroy so many tanks. We will take down the chemical weapons. And then he proceeds to sign an INF treaty, which no one thought we would ever get. One of the problems in dealing with the Russians and arms control has always been they've always had way more of everything than we had. And so if you brought it down 1 for 1, we got down to 0 and they still had a whole pile of them left. That we didn't want to do. So the same happened with the INF treaty, except they said, okay, we got a problem. We got a whole lot more than you got. So for every 1 you destroy, we'll destroy 3. So that when we all get done, we'll have 0 and you'll have 0. We said, asymmetrical reductions? You're going to agree to asymmetrical reductions? Yes, they are. Okay. Stunning. Absolutely stunning. But a fantastic precedent that we ought to really be taking advantage of. The second thing they agreed to that we never believed was on-site inspection to make sure it really happened. And so there we were. We watched it, and it happened. And they watched us, and it happened. So it seems to me we have a chance to lower the burden in Europe of defending Europe if instead of every offer that they make, we say, well, that's not enough. We come forward with a counter offer and say, okay, you say you'll lower your troops by 500,000. What about 1.5 million? And then we'd bring ours down by so much. Again, using the asymmetrical and on-site inspection precedence. Very important. We could lower the burden and help our allies be able to pick up more of it without having to spend a lot of money in the interim. So we got a lot of windows open that I don't see us aggressively enough out there pushing to make change. If you look at 1980, our allies were picking up a larger percentage of defense than they are today. We've gone through this Rambo mania period of the last 8 years where we've really felt that we don't dare use our brains in foreign policy, we can only use our glands. And it's really, the world's caught on. You know, it's dial 1-800-USA and we'll go anywhere. And we did. I mean, look at the Persian Gulf. We went steaming off there. It cost us about $100 per barrel of oil that we got out of there. If you add up the cost of what that cost us plus the barrels of oil that came out of there. Now, where did those barrels of oil go? They went to Japan and they went to Western Europe. It was real nice of us. Look, I come from an oil-producing state. You want oil? We'll get it to you for $18 a barrel and we'll gift wrap it. And you know, if we go in there, we should never go in there without others paying their own way. If you go back and look at history, you find that the way we really built up at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th was by convincing the British they should always keep the oceans open, and we traded right behind the British Navy. And what it did for Britain was bankruptcy. And now, what have they done? They've convinced us we keep all the oceans open and they trade right behind us. Our military allies over here are our trading competitors over here. So if we don't find some way that we're all contributing equally, now that we're at that equal level, we are really tying our hands behind our back in competition because we're spending our money for defense and they're spending their money for education, for research and development in the civilian area, for all sorts of things, and they go knock our socks off and trade. So it seems to me this is not such a puzzle. I mean, this is what we're trying to come out with, and this is not such a puzzle. But somehow we're just so afraid to change the status quo. And I think that's tragic because our whole tradition has been one of challenging the status quo and changing. I mean, this is the whole country made up of people who came here really courageous to uproot yourself and come here and start over. And it's been a constant challenging of the status quo. And now all of a sudden it's like we can't do it. So I guess that's what really drove me to it, saying, look, there's two pieces. We're not going to make it to the 21st century if the very foundation of this country is crumbling, and it is. The foundation of this country is the family. Each little building block, and how do I define family? It's wherever you go at night and they got to let you in. That's your family. Now, if those families are in real trouble, if they're in real trouble because of divorce or whatever it is, then the government that sits on top of all those little building blocks is in real trouble. It starts to crumble too. So we got to get back resources for restabilizing that family unit. The other thing that we have to deal with is that economic problem. Economic security is very important. Yes, there's a military threat. There's also the threat of the debt. And that's very big when you look at our future. And how do we do that? How do we solve that and get the resources for the family? Well, I think you get it by saying we've always treated NATO as though it was an alliance. We've never treated it as an empire. We were always told that this is what was going to happen. If we put our money in, as soon as they got on their feet, they were going to pick up more and we would all share and all this sort of thing. How come they're reneging on the deal now? We ought to be happy. This is what was supposed to happen. It also frees us up of an awful lot of money that we need to either redeploy other places or offset the debt. And it seems to me if we don't deal with those two things, we really are in big trouble as we look at the future. Now, I realize Japan's a little unique. And I must say, when I define the threat, I don't define it just militarily. I define the threat in what I think is the traditional American way, not the 1980s American way. The traditional American way has realized that, yes, there's a military threat. There's also an economic security threat. That's why we had a Marshall Plan, et cetera. If you don't stabilize these economies, you can have all the weapons in the world, and good luck, it isn't going to work. So you've got to do foreign aid, and you've got to do Marshall Plans, and so I think that's a piece of the threat. And I think now we're discovering there's another whole threat, and that's an environmental threat that's way beyond our borders, and that we're all going to have to work together with each other in the free world to try and figure out how we stabilize that. But what I would say is we got to find a way that each country that's got about the same living standard we do is contributing the same percentage of their gross national product to dealing with that threat. And they can put it all into environmental, or they can put it all into economic aid, or they can do defense, or however we assign it, we assign it. But if we're all putting that same amount, then when we move over here and become trading opponents, at least we're on a more equal playing field, and hopefully we're going to have a better planet to live on in the next century. So that's basically where I'm coming from. That's what the book talks about, along with all my personal funny experiences, which I will let you read. Didn't mean to make this quite so somber, but the personal funny things are all in there too, as to how you juggle all these wonderful roles and what's happening. So thank you for letting me be here tonight, and I'd be more than happy to answer questions. Thank you. Does anybody have a question? Mm-hmm. I think anything is possible. The statements in the cloakroom are always, there go the people, and we've got to get in front of them because we're their leaders. Now, I will grant you, in the 80s, most people checked their spines in the cloakroom. You know, I mean, starch has not been a real big commodity politically. And I must say I was also very disappointed when I've listened to the President's State of the Union and then all the responses. I don't see any starch yet. I mean, it sounds like voodoo too. We're going to cut capital gains taxes, and it will generate so much money that we'll be able to add all these new programs. And you think, well, if you take that to its logical extension, then we ought to totally cancel all taxes and would pay off the national debt. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. But, I mean, that's still being generated out there. That's still being talked about. And I think what people are saying by not having voted last time, by showing we've really got to start taking it back, and I think it will happen. I mean, I really do think it could happen if we utilize those resources, but it's a little embarrassing that the whole world is becoming more democratic and we're dropping out. If it weren't for Botswana, we would be at the very bottom of voter turnout. So as everybody else decides democracy is a great idea, we decide we don't like it. And I just think we've got to tell them why we don't like it, why we're dropping out, and why we want to see more starch come out of there. Yeah, I think there's a lot of people who are. And I think we just have to hang in there and keep building on that group, because it's really very important. And we have to make it look like there's a lot more to it. Yeah.
Congresswoman, could you comment on the re-election rate of House incumbents? I think it's 99% this time. And is the non-competitiveness of challengers a good thing or a bad thing, or can you just comment on that?
Well, I think it all depends on the incumbent, as you well know. Basically, what has happened is that it's become, the money in this stuff is just awful. Jefferson must spin in his grave, because I don't think Jefferson ever thought about political action committees and all that stuff. I mean, I think we should do away with all political action committees, and we should only allow individual contributions. That's really where we should go. As long as we don't do that, we're the only country I know where we play this game that corporate America gives you $10,000 because they believe in good government. They give you $10,000 because they want access and they want you to tap dance to their tune. I mean, is that clear? So why we allow that to keep going on, I don't know. But since what they want is access, and since you have that kind of an incumbent return, they are absolutely never going to fund a challenger. Okay? The other side of it is, though, is I don't think our challengers have been very creative. I mean, when I first ran, I went against a challenger. Our average campaign contribution was $7.50. I mean, nobody believes that. It was $7.50. So it was little people giving money, and we really went at him with all sorts of ads. Oh, I took them back to Washington, and they went into shock. My party wouldn't even take me around. They said, this stuff went out? I said, yeah, it went out. They said, this is awful. Get out of here. You know, we only back winners. First of all, we went to a paper company and said, we got about a penny per piece of paper. What have you got? And they said, well, we got some bright fuchsia and some bright greens and some bright, that were rejected. I mean, you're never supposed to do political things on these colors, right? We said, well, we got to take what you got, whatever it'll take for a penny. That was it. And then we put on them very stark messages. The messages were, we had the Olympics on the ballot then, which Colorado had no way to fund or anything else. So we had a picture of an older woman walking down the street in Denver with a cane. And underneath it, it said, cheer up, the Olympics are coming. With a message about, and then we don't deal with the fact that we have migrant children. And we had a migrant child sitting out under a crucifix on a dirt floor. It was about a year old. And it said, this radical troublemaker's out to get something from you. Hope. And we had a picture of our military cemetery with all the Vietnam graves, and a bird flying out over the top, and a quote from Nixon's speech. Many of our troops have already been withdrawn. So for 3 cents per household in Denver with volunteers, we had them with 3 heavy messages. On the back, we had a whole lot more. I took them to Washington and said, my God, don't you know anything? You hand out these tricolor brochures, you use red, white, and blue. You're supposed to be running down the steps with the dome in the back, then you open it up, you're supposed to have your picture taken with senior citizens, with a policeman, you know, with a little kid, and then you're supposed to be on a bike to show you're environmentally, you know, okay, and you're supposed to be for education, against the debt, and all this, but all you've done is stir up incredible, no way you can ever win. Okay. So that was the end of it. I mean, they wouldn't have any part of me, so we went back and kept doing our $7.50. We then produced our TV media, and it cost us $1,200, and we did it again at my kitchen table in black and white, and we built it around the posters, and it worked. I think if people think that you're not diddling them, they're really appreciative. But the problem is we've gotten into, and the challengers do it too, everybody goes out and hires these piranha fish that tell them the same thing. Wear a blue suit, a red tie, white shirt. You know, do this, be for America, be for families, be this, be that. And everybody sees through it. I mean, you're all very sophisticated. You see television, I mean, you all know the game. And so you look at it and you go, ugh, so what are they for? So if we get more creative challengers, it'll be one of the guys who beat a challenger this time. You know what he did? It was a wonderful idea. He had a little thing that hung on a rubber band. He got people to take them everywhere. It was a picture of himself on a television set. It said, please hang this on your television set because you won't be seeing me on TV. Turn it over and you'll know why. And on the other side it said, because I didn't take money from, and he lists all the people that his opponent took money from. Now that is a fairly clever thing. It didn't cost him much money. But we've all gotten into this new where the image is more important than the substance, and people are so worried about image, 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 and pro, and we're, you know, part of the challenges is they're not being creative. I could run a challenger race against anybody and have a lot of fun doing it. We got to do more of that. Yeah.
What concrete activism have you done for the environmental issue and peace issue?
More than I can live to tell. I've always had 100% environmental rating. I mean, we feel very strongly about that in Colorado. We feel we're the lungs of the nation where people came to breathe, and then we looked up one day and said, oh my God, what happened? So whether it's been Rocky Flats, which you've been reading about, which is one of the most polluted parts of America with the nuclear stuff, or anything else, we've done everything from being, from picketing out there with the people to introducing bills to the whole 9 yards. And the same on getting more wilderness, working on clean water, working on clean air. Actually, our city has been the one city where we have really made progress in clean air. We now change our gasoline component 2 months out of the year. We do all sorts of things, and we really are turning it around, which really says a lot about my city, that we haven't ducked it, we haven't run from it, and we haven't yielded to the bulldozer. So, really pleased about that. On the peace things, obviously, I've gotten the SANE Peace Award, all sorts of peace awards for having worked. Every year I did an alternative defense budget, saying nobody's talking about unilateral and nobody's talking about just standing out there and seeing if they hit you, but we are wasting so much money and showing where you could cut it all. And working on all those types of things. I do talk show arms control stuff for my colleagues. If you've ever gotten out in America and done talk shows, it's tough. And they've just got to learn how to handle it. You come out and you say, hi there, Omaha, I'm here and I'm for arms control. And some guy calls in and says, well, if you trust the Soviets, so, that's the trouble with Congress. They got people in there that trust the Soviets. We know they're bad. And I say, no, you missed it. The reason you negotiate with the Soviets is because you don't trust them. If we only negotiated with people we trusted, we'd be negotiating with the Canadians. And we don't negotiate with the Canadians because we trust them. I mean, that's what life's about. You only negotiate with people you don't trust. Well, they'll say then we don't want arms control done on trust. You say, wait a minute, you missed the whole point. It's not trust. It's got to be bilateral. It's got to be checked out every way from the moon. But it's amazing the myths floating around out there about peace in all of this. You're seeing it now, people saying, well, Gorbachev doesn't mean it, or he won't be in power long, or whatever. And you say, well, how do we know if he doesn't mean it? Why don't we propose something? And if he runs away from it, we know he doesn't mean it. But how do you read his mind? You're a better mind reader than I am. So, no, I've been out there very active on that and very frustrated very often by it. Because you do get beat up a lot on that area. Yes, sir.
Since it seems unlikely that communication other than television in campaigns can play a big role, do you think it would be wise to require television networks and television stations to provide free time, a certain limited amount, to candidates, and to forbid them from taking paid time beyond that in order to reduce the cost of campaigning?
I used to think that. But let me tell you about Thursday night, the night of the State of the Union. I got stranded in the Chicago O'Hare Airport. Little old naive me assumes that everybody in America wants to watch the State of the Union. This is the new president's first message, right? So I start through Chicago O'Hare Airport, and basically they have TVs up over the bars. You go up and say, excuse me, could we turn to... And about 15 people look at you and you think, God, if looks could kill, I'm dead. So you run to the next one, right? I went to 16 places and nobody would change the channel. I finally had to go to United Airlines and say, have you got an employee lounge or anything? I've got to see the President's State of the Union. I have to comment in the morning on Good Morning America. Please let me in. I have to debate, So they finally said, all right, we'll let you into the employee lounge. Employees were furious. They said, this is a Congresswoman and she has to watch. Well, this is our lounge, damn it, and we're watching Knots Landing. And I'm saying, I'm sorry, I gotta watch the president's speech. Your plane was late and you made me do it. So they start phoning people saying, please tape it. Tape Knots Landing. We got this Congresswoman in our lounge insisting on watching the president's speech. I tell that story because I worry that if we say that, nobody's going to watch it. Is anybody going to watch those debates on television? I don't think so. I mean, our local channels in Denver give us all time to debate, and I would not want to know what the viewer rate is. I think it's my mother, maybe my dog, and my opponent's mother, and that may be it.
And why does television time cost so much for you?
Because that's all the commercial stuff. It's the commercial stuff that hits you when you weren't. You're watching Knots Landing, and they slip a 30-second ad in there telling you to vote for X and try and hit your hot buttons when they do it. So it is troubling. I have a good friend who works at National Geographic who said the most frustrating thing is he keeps getting these assignments that don't work anymore. He was told to go out and film town meetings in America. He said, there aren't any. You ever tried to find a town meeting in America? Good luck. And I think that's candidate forums and televised candidate forums don't go particularly well. I think what you do is you got to get the big money out of it, number one. Number two, I do think, I mean, you are right. I mean, I would certainly say to the television people that they must all do public service time. I don't believe in deregulating them. I think they must do public service time, and they must do equal time, and they should do debates rather than 30-second ads and who can buy the most. No question about that. Now, I mean, you can't make people watch it. And we've got to be realistic enough to know that a lot of people aren't going to watch it. It's going to be like the State of the Union. But we've really got to somehow get this back on track where we're dealing with issues and not image. And all of us have got to think about how we do that. I don't think there's any real easy answer. But the thing that costs is they charge you what they charge Pepsi. Yeah.
Ma'am, would you please comment on the pay raise? I was appalled. I'm a supporter of Mr. Nader, but I was appalled at his action in that area. I was also appalled because of what it's done to our justice system, our judges, people like this, that decidedly deserve more pay. I think that you deserve more pay. I have a congressman in my own district that I would like to cut his pay. That's neither here nor there. For $24 million, that's a paltry sum.
It is, yeah.
I'm also against honorariums. Would you please comment?
Well, I'm against honorariums too. That's the easy part. I think what happened with the pay raise is that we are getting much too much government by commission. It's like we have checked our spine, and we want to say the commission made us do it. The commission made us take the pay raise. The commission made us do this to the debt. Graham Rudman made us do that. And the idea then is nobody can figure out to say, well, who voted to give the commission the authority, or who voted for Graham Rudman that did the automatic chopping, or who voted for... I think what happened is people got a little angry with the process. Don't stand there and tell me that you didn't want the pay raise, but the commission made you take it. Unless you want to tell me that you believe in the tooth fairy, and you don't. The only way the Congress is going to get a pay raise is if they stand up and say they need it, they justify it, they show that because we're equal with other branches and the other branches need it and they justify it. You've got to just pull up your socks and deal with it straight on. But that's not what's going on right now. Everybody's trying to be everything to everybody. I do think it's also very troubling to do this first off in a year where we have not dealt with the deficit for 8 years. You say, now we'll get our pay raise first thing, and then we'll see if we can deal with the deficit. I mean, I think a lot of people were really upset about that. And there's some real legitimacy to that we had not dealt with the big issues in front of us. But until, you just can't duck these things. You can't say all the tough issues get sent off to commissions, and then we find some way that automatically this all happens, because folks are smarter than that. And they say, if you want to justify your pay raise, come out and justify it, but don't hide. And then I don't think that Wright, with his ethical problems and everything else being set up out there, that helped either. I mean, it was just a whole combination. And there were no other issues to talk about. And catastrophic, you know, the increase in catastrophic, so people were mad about that. And it just is not a good time. People are down on government. It's trivializing the whole process. And we've got to find some way to rebuild some confidence in it, I think. Yeah.
What do you think Congress's position is going to be this year with regard to military in Central America, specifically Salvador and Nicaragua? And also, what's your reading of the White House's position on this, which seems to be a bit of an ideological departure from the previous administration, but I'm not sure. I'd like to know what your insight is.
Well, the only thing I can figure out is the White House isn't going to do too much, because it's very clear they polled almost every day during the presidential election. And it's also very clear that their polling must have told them that they got nowhere on that issue, because they never, I mean, the words never left their lips. They never said anything about Central America and we must take on the Sandinistas at all costs and all of that sort. I mean, they really didn't do it. So they didn't say much. They don't have a lot of promises they have to worry about there, and that's good news. The bad news is I'm scared to death about Panama. I mean, that's where we ought to be scared to death. I hope all of you know what's happened. We have now brought home 60 of our 160 State Department people there. We do not recognize the current president. Because of that, we will not get any new license plates for any cars of any American officials in Panama, and I think all the license plates run out the end of this month. We are now talking about renting cars for every single American connected to the embassy. We cannot get any new Americans in or out because they do not recognize our visas, because we do not recognize them. And that is a very troubling thing, because Panama could tighten real fast and we could have kind of an Iran situation, where they can say, we don't recognize diplomatic immunity because you don't recognize our government. And that's obviously why we're taking people out of there as fast as we can. But that is a very tense thing. And then when you have Ronald Reagan saying, we just might have to take the canal back. I mean, that'll be great. Oh boy, get on a white horse and here we go. But that will stir up Central America like you have not seen anything. So I really think maybe our emphasis and fears better shift. We better be looking at Panama, and we better be really watching that closely, because I don't know what's going to happen, but it's very troubling to me to see where we are right now and figure out how we wiggle out of it. You know, we've had a couple sailors beaten up. We've had some service people shot. There's an awful lot of tension. People don't want to leave the base. We've got soldiers who were living on the economy wanting us to build them more housing on the base. We kind of hate to build a lot of housing on the base because we're going to end up turning it over to Panama if the treaty goes through. So someone's saying, well, let's start trailer parks. You know, all of this is really, and that could blow up Central America like you've never seen.
What about the congressional sentiment with regard to the Contras?
I don't think you're going to see any funding for the Contras by the Congress. I think that they've pretty well lost their luster with the ones that had it. We now are seeing, you know, those governments all meeting in San Salvador this week. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. But even there, it sounds like Ortega is singing a different tune, more conciliatory. So maybe they can work something out. But I think that Congress is much more into that kind of a regional solution where the countries get together and take it over. And as I say, we may be so focused on that that we don't catch what happens in Panama. And that could blow it all off the face of the map. Yes, ma'am.
What's your analysis of the Jackson campaign and what significance that has for, say, for the future of American politics and the changing American political sentiment?
Well, I think Jesse Jackson is very interesting in that for an awful lot of people who feel disenfranchised, they felt that he was talking to them. in '84, I was supposed to watch all the TV tapes for the Hart campaign and say what I saw. The interesting thing is I really watched all the candidates with children. There was only one guy who looked comfortable with them, Jesse Jackson. I mean, they put a baby in front of Gary Hart and he shook its hand. I remember seeing that tape and I ran for the phone and said, "Oh, if I ever see you do that again, I will die. You know, don't do this." So he looked very comfortable in that situation. He was going at, the other thing that as I watch tapes, it's fascinating and I don't know why. I mean, I haven't had time to analyze why, but he seems to be the only guy that reaches kids on drugs. I don't know why. I mean, white people go in and talk to kids too, but somehow we don't get through. He seems to get through as I look at those tapes, and there's a real question of why, I don't know. But he does seem to reach people that no one else is quite able to reach. I think the most shocking part, and I don't mean to offend anyone, it offended me, and then when I listened to it again, I was in Indiana this year campaigning for the ticket, and I ran into this guy who had on overalls. He was probably in his mid-80s, a ball cap on, you know. He's kind of, I said, "How are you? I hope you're going to vote." He said, "Nah, lady, I'm not going to vote." And I said, "Why aren't you going to vote? It's very important to vote." He said, "Well, I'd have voted if the nigger got it." I just about dropped my teeth. You know, I'd never heard language like that. And I thought, now how can he be saying that and how can he be saying the other? So I started talking to him, and he's really alienated. You know, here's this older man who's really alienated, and somehow that got through, even though he's as biased as you can believe. I mean, I couldn't put the pieces together. I couldn't process it. I didn't have a database for where it went. But I do think he reached an awful lot of people that the PR consultants and everybody else wrote off. And I guess we got to find a way to start talking to people and not writing them off in the society and determining everybody's a suburban Better Homes and Garden type. And that was the lesson to me, and whether we get that, I don't know. I certainly hope we don't break out into racial politics. I think that's the worst thing that could happen. And so we'll see. Yeah.
What do you think it says about the mentality of the American public where a stupid, bumbling idiot like Ronald Reagan could be considered to be one of the most popular presidents of all time, who's practically deified as he leaves office, as if this man made absolutely no mistakes at all while he was president? And I'm just wondering, doesn't that make you feel ashamed to be an American when people vote for Ronald Reagan in such overwhelming majorities? And I mean, I think it's just a shame.
Well, the world is certainly perplexed, and I'm certainly perplexed. I don't get it. I mean, you know, here's this guy riding into the sunset with more debt that he's accumulated than all presidents before him put together, with more scandals in his administration than all presidents put together. Tonight we hear on the nightly news that this whole fight about the Oliver North thing is that Oliver North implicates the president and said he knew about Irangate and was doing the funding from day one. And everybody says, isn't it great? I am totally fascinated. I mean, at a time when we're supposed to be worried about competitiveness, he made it a very positive thing not to work at all. And, you know, you just kind of dung, dung, dung. I mean, I really don't get it at all, except that I'm Irish. So I guess I can say this. I am Irish, and I grew up in a home where my father always said, the good Lord invented whiskey so the Irish wouldn't rule the world. And as I look at Ronald Reagan, I think there may be some truth. The charm that came through and the acting talent that came through, people saw him. I thought the New Yorker did the best piece I've ever seen on Ronald Reagan, where they pulled together all the books that had been written and ran it as a side-by-side almost. And they point out how to everybody, including his own staff and including his own kids and including everybody, they saw him as this warm, loving person. very warm, very loving. But in reality, it wasn't that way at all. And that's why the staff aides all left and wrote these terrible books, and his kids wrote these terrible books. And because people would at first think that it was their fault. Here's this warm, loving man, and he's not reaching out to me. It must be me. And then they found out he didn't reach out to anybody except maybe Nancy. But it still comes across that way. I mean, he always had that wonderful thing. You could stand up and say, this man did this, and this man did that, and this man did that. And he could say, oh, would Ronald Reagan do that? And people's hearts melted. No, he wouldn't do that. He's nice. But he certainly did redefine morality. If you look at morality in politics, it was always immoral to say something that was untruthful. He redefined it so that you had absolutely no liability for the content. It was only immoral not to deliver it in the most effective fashion. He redefined it so you have no liability for content. Someone else did the content. Thank you very much. You're only into delivery. And it's like a real figurehead. I often think of George Washington. It's almost his birthday. He must be dying. Remember? I mean, he won that revolution. And they went to him and said, why don't you be king, George? And he said, you forgot what it was all about. As he watched this last time, he must have thought they forgot what it was all about. We almost ended up with a king. But it certainly did work, and nobody really gets it. But I think it's Hollywood. Yeah.
What kind of things are pending now in Congress, if any, with respect to some of the things you mentioned, like discrimination against pregnant women and child care?
Family medical leave is the most important. It is ready. We will have it on the House floor by Mother's Day. We're shameless. It is the 10 weeks leave without pay for either men or women upon birth, adoption of a baby, critical illness of a dependent child or a dependent parent, and leave without pay in case you yourself, the wage earner, get critically ill. I mean, right now in America, you can fire someone for getting sick. If you get cancer, your employer can fire you. It's stressful enough having cancer, but your insurance is probably tied to your job. Try that for a double number. I mean, so this bill we hope to have on the floor. The child care package is coming right behind it, expanding Head Start and trying to get more quality child care around the country. We are having, at the end of this week, a big symposium at Harvard where for the first time we're getting really sophisticated tax lawyers to show what's happened the last 8 years. It's been a tax shifting onto the family. And we want to get a family tax package ready to go. Nobody's probably going to touch taxes for a couple years, but get it out there and get it focused and get it going. We also have a whole thing dealing with part-time work. They took away the deduction for being able to have an office in your home. Well, we ought to be able to encourage people. If we want them to do family, they ought to be able to write at home. They ought to be all sorts of things at home. Write that off. It's a business. We ought to be trying to enhance part-time, flexi-time, flexi-place, any other thing we can that allows that to transpire. So that's all out there. And, of course, the equal pay for equal work and all the other things are there, too. And hopefully we can get that going. I think we have time for about one more question, and then we got to close it out. You want to go clear in the back?
What is your assessment, Congresswoman, of George Bush and the likelihood that he is going to face up to some of the issues that you raised?
I wish I could say what everybody else says. Everybody wants to be popular and loved. I'm very troubled by George Bush. I think he's going to be even tougher than Ronald Reagan. I kind of see Washington right now as my country club 'tis of thee. We're all being nice and sweet and wonderful. And I hope I'm wrong, but I don't see anybody wanting to make a hard choice. Here is my budget. I'm going to tell you all the new add-ons, all the good things that I'm going to do for you. I'm not going to tell you about any of the cuts. And I'm going to tell the Congress they ought to make the cuts because we ought to do something about the debt. And the Congress is not going to get their spines back with that kind of rhetoric. They're going to do the same thing. They're going to match it. And what has happened, under the Reagan years, he would bring us such a stupid budget, that it would be dead on arrival, dead before arrival, why waste the paper of writing it on? It would be so easy that every year the Congress could do a better budget than he did. And then, like small children, we would sit there and say, our budget's better than his budget. Well, it probably was, not by much, but he gave us such an easy mark. And I guess what I'm saying is I was really hoping George Bush would come in and plant the flag and challenge us to do something better. But I think he wants everybody to like him, and I don't know what his plan is yet. I mean, I still don't know what his plan is. On family medical leave, he says he agrees with it in concept, but he's against the bill. What does that mean? You know, on child care, he's for giving every family that makes $8,000 a year or less a $1,000 tax credit so the women can stay home. Where in America can you stay home on $9,000 a year and you couldn't on $8,000? I want to find this place. I haven't seen it, you know. So it all kind of sounds good, and then you kind of sort it out, and it's not there. I don't see him making the hard choices on arms control or the hard choices on trade or the hard choices on burden sharing that I think need to be dealt with. It's just status quo, and everybody be happy, not to worry, we're not going to rock the boat. Now, hopefully I'm wrong. Hopefully it changes. I'm totally delighted with Barbara Bush because I love gray hair, as you can well tell, and I'm, you know, tired. I mean, that to me is a little refreshing. But I don't think that you say the way we're going to solve America's problems is with 1,000 points of light, and we're all going to go out and we're going to volunteer more. When? At 2:30 in the morning? I mean, you know, when are people going to volunteer more? People are really pushing very hard to even produce what they're doing. So I think we have to listen to it and make sure we're not listening to it with nostalgia, but with the reality. And hopefully the Congress challenges him to do better, and hopefully he challenges us to do better, because I don't think there's any record out there we're real proud of in the last 8 years. It's like everybody's been on sabbatical. But I don't think we can afford another 8 years of it. So let's see what happens. Thank you all very much for coming. You're a very patient audience. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.